What a difference a week makes. U.S. President Joe Biden's political days are numbered, and here comes Vice President Kamala Harris to take on Donald Trump. What the mainstream media got wrong on the Biden story, what the alternative media got right, and where the American presidential election goes from here. Plus, Bangladesh. Sheikh Hasina's government cracks down, including online blackouts and police violence, to get protesters off the streets. Washington has never seen a week quite like it, starting on Sunday, when President Joe Biden took himself out of the election race. By Tuesday, his vice president, Kamala Harris, had picked up the torch and was on the campaign trail. On Wednesday, Biden addressed the nation, explaining his decision. The pace at which this story has unfolded across the American media has left liberal commentators gasping for air. They quickly dispensed with their criticism of Biden for selfishly clinging to power and started eulogizing him for a selfless change of heart. Voices on the right, meanwhile, have already played the race card against Kamala Harris. The attempted assassination of Donald Trump, which happened just 2 weeks ago, suddenly seems like old news. Also lost in this blizzard of developments is a realistic assessment of Joe Biden's political legacy, especially the genocide that his government has effectively sponsored in Gaza and the blood on his hands, Palestinian blood.
So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation.
If, as they say, a week really is a long time in politics, this past week in Washington felt like it went by in a flash. Last Sunday, 3 weeks after his debacle of a debate, Joe Biden tweeted out his letter announcing he will not run again. He endorsed his vice president, Kamala Harris. Within 48 hours, Harris had the backing of power brokers like the Clintons and dozens of members of Congress. One by one, prospective challengers, most of them state governors, stepped aside. The donor money was pouring in, making Harris a lock for the Democratic nomination. And she sounded like it at her first campaign speech in the swing state of Wisconsin.
I took on perpetrators of all kinds. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
It seems that their strategy is going to be very similar to the 2020 strategy, which is drawing a stark contrast between herself and Donald Trump. We're seeing her call out pretty pointedly his alleged sexual assaults, his convictions, and other allegations of corruption. We're also seeing her campaign take this tack where they're sort of brushing Trump off as a joke a little bit.
Harris is already casting herself as the prosecutor who can take down the felon here. Some of the excitement around her is just that she does have a very prosecutorial approach to politics.
Yes or no?
As a senator, she was always very good in hearing, with perfectly set up questions of pharmaceutical executives and Trump administration officials to get them where she wants to go.
Be sure about your answer, sir.
And that is exciting for Democrats because they have not been confident that Joe Biden, who speak coherently, let alone actually prosecute the case or make an argument to voters that they should support him for another term.
We're now looking at a very different split screen when you think about the two nominees.
Dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if
between former President Trump and President Biden, it was not only a rematch, but it was two elderly white men compared with now former President Trump and Vice President Harris, who is not only younger, but she's a woman of color. There's also going to be a real effort to put front and center some of the issues that they feel are vulnerabilities for Republicans. She had really emerged as the Biden administration's leading voice on reproductive rights. It's going to be one of the key issues for the Harris campaign.
Sick of this. Even before Kamala Harris was crowned by Democratic kingmakers, voters were getting a sneak preview online of what her election campaign would look like.
She prosecuted sex predators. He is one.
It was not a new ad. Harris took that approach when she tried to run against Donald Trump 4 years ago, but was trounced in the race for the Democratic nomination by Joe Biden. After 3 weeks of intense speculation over the 81-year-old Biden's future, the Democratic base and its media proxies were instantly energized by the young blood Harris brings. Somewhat lost in the euphoria is the fact, recently raised by a comedian who usually targets his jokes at Donald Trump, that back in 2020, Kamala Harris's campaign was an absolute flop.
You can count the number of delegates she won in the 2020 primaries on one hand, as long as that hand has no finger.
More hostile voices on the right are going after Harris for covering up for Biden's infirmity and pandering to the racist vote, calling her a DEI hire.
The DEI vice president is the future of the party here, and so the future looks kind of dim for the Democrats.
DEI stands for diversity, equality, and inclusion, standards designed to ensure fair representation in workplaces and institutions, a practice dismissed by right-wingers as woke.
It is going to be a very ugly campaign. They're repeatedly referring to her as a quote-unquote DEI hire, which is effectively new conservative code toward people of color.
Joe Biden did not choose her based on merit. He chose her based on the same criteria of DEI that has been destroying this country.
That's a message that resonates more with the Republican base, but could backfire when it comes to the types of voters that could ultimately swing an election.
There's also been no sense that Trump or any other Republican has figured out how actually to attack Harris right now. This is amazing as someone who covered the 2020 Democratic primary, where she floundered, essentially. Other Democrats rightly pointed out that she was a lightweight on policy.
The whole campaign was tactics. There was never this is why I'm running.
And yet, what we're seeing so far is Republicans just consistently falling into race and gender-based attacks.
But if you say she's not good enough, then what will you be called? A racist.
They had a month to prepare for this eventuality, and they weren't ready when it happened.
Joe Biden's decision to step aside, which was so long in coming, still managed to surprise elements in the liberal media as well. Many of the same people who had pushed him to quit the race weeks before praised him lavishly for finally putting the country first.
I'm struck by the humility of that speech.
Tears were shed by members of the liberal media brigade that has come to be known as Blue Maga, the Democratic Party's cult-like version of Donald Trump's Make America Great Again base.
And then you just cry, because this is somebody that you love.
What most of those eulogies left out was any meaningful discussion of Biden's real legacy, his unbridled support in 2003 for the disastrous U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, a war based on lies, and his continued backing and arming of Israel's genocidal war on Palestinians in Gaza.
You had Van Jones shedding tears on national television, talking about how dismayed and saddened he was about the position that Biden was in. Many of these eulogizing personal accounts about Biden's honor.
As a good man, he fell on the sword.
What stands out more is there is absolutely no way to remember Biden's legacy without acknowledging the role that his administration has played in allowing genocide to continue in Gaza.
You saw the kind of backlash he was facing from key Democratic constituencies, not just Muslim and Arab Americans, young voters, black voters. It was a pretty diverse coalition saying they don't accept the administration's approach toward the war in Gaza. And I think that that is absolutely one of the darker parts of his legacy. And when you've seen such a high civilian death toll in Gaza, you've seen famine and widespread starvation, that's something that will continue and weigh on Biden's legacy.
The rapid-fire developments coming out of Washington have overshadowed another newsworthy story: Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's trip to D.C. and his speech to Congress. Thousands of pro-Palestinian activists protested his address, which more than half the Democratic caucus boycotted. The lawmakers who were there ate up what Netanyahu was telling them, including outright lies, like his denial that Israel is starving Palestinians in Gaza.
This is utter, complete nonsense. It's a complete fabrication.
Kamala Harris chose not to attend the address, but that was mere virtue signaling, since she did meet with Netanyahu the next day.
We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
Joe Biden literally embraced Benjamin Netanyahu after October 7th. Kamala Harris is not going to do that. So if you watch right-wing outlets, there's been an effort to treat this as a kind of snub or even a scandal.
She is siding with Hamas over Israel. That's despicable.
What these attacks overlook, though, is that Harris is largely where most Americans are. She thinks that Israel has a right to defend itself, but doesn't like how it's doing that. She doesn't like Benjamin Netanyahu.
She has been ahead of Biden.
There must be an immediate ceasefire.
But Harris has a close relationship with the leading pro-Israel lobbying group, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, and has not indicated that she will show a significant foreign policy shift in comparison with how Biden has handled this.
When we fight, we win!
The departure of Joe Biden from the presidential campaign, the injection of Kamala Harris into it, have provided the Democratic Party with an adrenaline boost and supplied the media with a brand new narrative. But beyond that, on Israeli war crimes in Gaza, it's just more of the same. Shun Benjamin Netanyahu in public, but meet him on the side. Express concern over what the Israelis are doing to Palestinians, but never condemn it. And that does not bode well. We'll return to the political story in the U.S. in just a few minutes, but first, Bangladesh and a power struggle between the Prime Minister and protesters that has rocked the country. The unrest has calmed somewhat over the past few days, but nationwide restrictions on communications and media remain in place. Meenakshi Ravi has been tracking this story.
The protests in Bangladesh began over what's commonly known as the quota system, the way government jobs are reserved for certain classes of people. However, the unrest has grown to become about a much more fundamental issue: Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, her government, and corruption. Back at the start of the month, the demonstrations were peaceful. But the violence meted out to protesters ensured that even after the government climbed down on the quota system, the political unrest would continue. More than 170 protesters have been killed, many by police who had been given orders by the Prime Minister to shoot on sight. Another 2,400 have been arrested. According to the press freedom group RSF, at least 30 journalists were assaulted and wounded, either shot by the police or attacked by pro-government counter-protesters. It's difficult to determine if those figures of the dead, detained and disappeared are up to date, since the internet and telecommunications blackout imposed as a security measure is still largely in place. Since Sheikh Hasina came to power for a second time in 2009, Bangladesh's democracy has taken an authoritarian turn. The Hasina government has a tight grip across institutions, including the media, which has seen adversarial and dissenting voices aggressively silenced or exiled. In the days and weeks to come, as restrictions ease in Bangladesh, we will no doubt get more details of what went down during the blackouts and how likely it is that more protests are to come.
Thanks, Meena. Back to the U.S. presidential race. For months, even years, much of the American mainstream media downplayed or ignored the obvious, the unmistakable signs of Joe Biden's cognitive decline. After his disaster of a debate, the about turn from many in the liberal commentariat has been spectacular. Media pundits, as well as Democratic donors and party bigwigs, all came for Biden. He was never going to survive that. One commentator who can honestly say he dissented from mainstream opinion and saw this coming is Cenk Yuger. Having done a stint as a host at MSNBC, he is the co-creator of an online outlet, the Young Turks. Yuger has used his alternative news platform to warn that sticking with Biden would be disastrous. Last year, he even launched his own short-lived bid to become the Democratic candidate. He insisted he wasn't in it to win it. He was just trying to draw others into the ring, that someone, anyone, needed to challenge Biden. Yuger released a campaign ad that focused on the U.S.'s continuing support for Israel, It's war on Gaza and what that support costs American voters and their families.
You're gonna have to put those eggs back.
They don't like eggs anymore?
No, they like eggs, but we have to set that $7 aside for killing Palestinians.
What? I mean, don't we give Israel $4 billion a year anyways?
Yeah, and now we're giving them another $14 billion.
Cenk Yuger joins me now from his home studio in Los Angeles, California. Cenk, it's been a while since we've had you on the listening post. It's great to have you back. Now, you've been warning for the best part of a year that the Biden campaign would eventually implode over the aging issue. What were you seeing that other political journalists were not, or were they seeing the same thing you were, only not saying it?
Yeah, there's a couple of factors here. Number one, I was looking at the underlying numbers. His approval rating has been in the 30s for over a year. An incumbent in the 30s almost never wins in the U.S. So I was startled that others were not making that realization, especially because he had lost Hispanic voters, he had lost young voters. These are stunning developments in American politics. I think the number one reason that people don't see it is because they live in a bubble. And everyone around them says, oh, no, everything's fine. And why do they think that in Washington and in mainstream media? It's because it's very insulting to the powerful if you note things about them that are unfortunate, and then you might lose access. And so there are repercussions. And the last reason, Richard, is because they don't talk to enough real people, non-political people. And every time I talk to a non-political person, the number one reason they would give for not voting for Joe Biden was he's too old. It was obvious.
Even after Biden's historically bad performance in that debate, many of the big names in the U.S. media still kept backing him, despite all the signs that you're talking about. What has this story exposed to Americans about the behavior of their mainstream news outlets, the denial, the delusion that we were getting?
Yeah, it is a bit of a heartbreaking realization, and I had it late in my career, very late, but most of news is not actually news. It's marketing. It's marketing for the powerful, and they have different clients, basically. Fox News does marketing for right-wing billionaires and multinational corporations. CNN does marketing for status quo and corporate rule. MSNBC does it for the Democratic Party, and I know I was a host on MSNBC, and they told me to not criticize the Democratic Party. That's not real news. That's just the propaganda arm of a set of powerful people.
One term that's entered the American political lexicon recently is blue MAGA. Now, you've been using that phrase for a while to describe the Democratic version of Trump's Make America Great Again movement, both on the ground and in media outlets. What have Americans learned about blue MAGA media outlets over the past month or so since the debate?
Yeah. At the top is the donor class. They actually control pretty much everything. Right underneath them is politicians, but they're not that interesting. They're just servants of the donor class. And then you have the media underneath them. And the media is the marketing arm for corporate rule. And they're the most powerful weapon, I would say, for the rich and for the donors. And so at the very bottom is the actual people. And those folks are often deluded. Red MAGA, blue MAGA. They live in a bubble where they can't see straight. So people in red MAGA actually believe that Donald Trump won the last election. People in blue MAGA actually thought that Joe Biden was young and dynamic. But where did they get those opinions? They got them from media, and media that is paid to be the marketing arm of these different groups of wealthy people. So they actually meant to deceive them, and they did.
Let's talk about the process. You wrote this week that the Democrats had a chance to electrify the country with an open convention, the most exciting dynamic process in the world to take place, with various candidates, governors, senators, various members of the party perhaps stepping forward. That's not happening, but you've also been praising Kamala Harris's great start to this campaign. So where do you stand now on the party's decision to effectively anoint Harris?
Right. So I was positive that Joe Biden was going to lose, and I would say things like he has a near 0% chance of winning. And people said, oh, that's outrageous. Now, afterwards, they acknowledge, yes, even his top advisors thought he had no chance of winning. Now, I'm positive that an open convention is the better way to go. The reason for that is that if you test your candidates, you will see how strong they are. The number one problem we had with Joe Biden was that we didn't test them. So if we have an open convention where they all vie for the delegates, then the strongest candidate comes out. That's definitely the best process. Now, having said that, Kamala Harris locked up a lot of these delegates. They're just pledged. They haven't voted yet. And she's come out of the gate very strong with a couple of savvy political moves and some really good speeches. So if she was strong enough to lock up these delegates quickly, well, that shows you that she might be a good candidate. I don't have an opinion on which candidate it should be. I have an opinion that we should pick the strongest one so we can beat Trump.
There are so many forces at play that came together to unseat Joe Biden. There was that debate, there was the change in the media discussion, and the donors. And what role have alternative media like yours played in this? Is this a moment of vindication for independent media outlets like your own?
Well, I appreciate that question, and it definitely is. And we had a swarm of viewers come to us after Biden dropped out saying, you were right. And a lot of folks said, look, I doubted you because I'm hearing different things. I'm hearing something from CNN and MSNBC that I'm not hearing from you. And one of our viewers said, look, I tried to introduce my parents to you, but it was so jarring because what you're saying is so true and so different than what they're hearing from mainstream media that it takes them a little time to adjust. But I think that independent media here was greatly vindicated. I feel terrific about it because it's not just that we're doing real news. It's that we're able to break even our own bubble. And again, if you don't live here in America, it's hard to understand how overwhelming the propaganda is. So if you just say normal, rational things, the rest of the media attacks you with great vigor. And it takes a lot to withstand those kind of attacks and gaslighting that happens perpetually.
Last question for you. The other great divide in American media, mainstream versus alternative, has been on the Gaza-Israel story. Biden's complicity in Israel's genocidal war cost him critical support amongst young voters. Do you foresee Kamala Harris changing that policy in any significant way? Because how else can she get those votes back to the Democratic Party, those young voters?
Yeah, so yes and no. I think that she will change the rhetoric a little bit. And I think that there's some chance she actually, in her heart, does believe that Israel should let up on the Palestinians. But now the heartbreaking part is that, no, she will not change the policy. And here, the American people have already moved. Here, this is another giant win for independent media and social media, because we broke the hypnosis that the American people were under. We talked about propaganda and marketing for mainstream media before. There is no issue that they've done that more for than on Israel. And it was overwhelming, and you couldn't fight that machine. But now, through social media and independent media, we've swarmed them, and we've changed the American electorate's opinion, especially for young voters. So that is why Kamala Harris has to change her rhetoric to try to win Michigan, to try to win over younger voters that the Democrats desperately need. But the donor class here is gigantic, and their power is overwhelming. So until we have a bit of a political revolution in America where a progressive that's in my camp wins the presidency, there is no way that they'll change their opinion on Israel, because they don't have an opinion. They only have checks. AIPAC completely controls the U.S. Congress, and you saw a spectacular example of that yesterday when they were all giving standing ovations over and over again to one of the worst war criminals in our lifetimes.
Cenk Yuger, great work by you and your team at the Young Turks. Keep it up. And once again, great to have you back on the air here at the Listening Post.
Thank you.
And finally, the performative political spectacle that was the Israeli Prime Minister's speech to the U.S. Congress this past Wednesday. Benjamin Netanyahu's appearance was boycotted by the Democrats' presumptive nominee, Kamala Harris, as well as roughly half of the party's congressmen and women. Hundreds of other senators and representatives were there, though, taking their seats, although they didn't use them much. A fast-forward version of the speech shows American politicians giving Netanyahu 49 standing ovations. 49, getting up and down like yo-yos. for a prime minister who faces an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court for war crimes. A leader that polls say has a 72% disapproval rating in his own country. We'll leave you with the rest of that video, and we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.